All right. So it has been a few minutes. My name is Jayshree Srinivasan. I'm a student at Mount Hebron High School in Howard County represent. And I've also been working with the Maryland Center for School Safety for about the past 2 years now. I'm their student member on their Maryland Center for School Safety Advisory Board, and I'm also the student lead of the Maryland Center for School Safety Student Focus Group. To kind of break up the dialogue today and to make sure that it's not just me talking at you the entire time, we are going to be joined by some of our lovely members from the student focus group, many of whom have already kind of introduced themselves in the chat, but you will be hearing a bit more from them later. So before we move into everything, I just want to address the idea of putting things in the comments and putting things in the Q&A. So feel free to make any comments or put things in the Q&A, and I will try to address them as they come up. If for some reason you notice that I'm not addressing them, then I promise that those comments and your questions will be addressed by representatives from the Maryland Center for School Safety at a later date. So you will get your answers to your questions and your comments. So before we move on, I said earlier that we're going to be joined by students from the Maryland Center for School Safety Student Focus Group. So what is that group? That group is composed of 11 students from 11 different counties. Welcome to all of you who are joining us. We're just about ready to get started here. So the student focus group, we have students from different counties, and one huge part of that is just starting open dialogues about school safety issues, like what we're trying to do today with the idea of student stress. So now, before I bring in our first guest, it's been a pretty big year, a lot of big changes. So let's kind of recap everything that has gone on, right, to set the context and the stage for today. So about a year ago now, yes, it's pretty crazy to think it was a year ago, but about a year ago now, around March mid for most people, to online schools, and now we've been living in this world of online schooling for quite some time. And as a student focus group, we had the opportunity to speak with Miss Candace Yoder from the Matthew Silverman Memorial Foundation, and she was talking about how specific groups of students are more impacted by these changes due to COVID than others. So I think that we're ready to bring in our first guest from the student focus group. Please join me in welcoming Kevin, and he's going to the specific student.
Okay. Hey, can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can hear you
Okay.
perfect.
I know it was kind of like kicking me out, like and in, so it might be a problem.
Right. Fingers crossed that you do stay in the entire time and you have an amazing conversation with us.
Yep. Fully hoping.
So, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yep. So hey everyone, my name is Kevin Bokum. I go to North Hagerstown High School in Washington County, and I am a junior.
Right. And
Yeah.
I also know that you're the amazing Washington County SMOB. So I imagine that in addition to having your own point of view about COVID changes and all that stuff, you've had the opportunity to hear from a lot of different students and stakeholders from across the state. So what has that looked like?
It's been actually very. It's been a lot of information coming at me because as being SMOB, you are a representative for just everyone in your county. So you get to hear different concerns, different worries, and even you get to hear praise. It's all directed all at you because you represent the students. So in that, I've particularly heard from a lot of athletes. I've heard from a lot of um, people who might be susceptible to what has been going on for the past year, particularly EL students. And I also heard occasionally from those students who are concerned about testing and all that. So from those really test anxiety people and people who are really high achieving. So those are really the key people who I've been hearing from.
Right. So you mentioned a few different groups there in your overview, I guess. So looking at EL students specifically, just for those of the audience who might be joining us and not familiar with EL students, could you break down what are EL students? What is that group? And also, how have they been impacted, especially by the changes that COVID has posed?
Mhm. So EL basically means English learner. Other districts and other school systems may call it ESOL, EFL, English foreign language, or basically any other group. But it's all boils down to just students whose first language is not English. So you could be coming from China, not speaking English as their first language, knowing Chinese as their first language, or you'd be coming from Guatemala, speaking Spanish, not knowing English as their first language. And so, really, um, what makes it hard with EL students is that their first primary language is not English, so it makes a really big communication barrier.
Mhm.
And with COVID, that's been extended.
So with COVID, what kinds of challenges are they facing? In addition to what they might already face at school in person.
So I first want to touch on what they faced in person while we were back. So
Right.
many of our EL students, they after school they can't participate in extracurricular activities due to having to support their families, due to having to look out for their younger siblings, because a lot of our EL students, they're a really big asset to their families. So they already had not as much social opportunities as a typical student would.
Mhm.
So then, as soon as March hit around, as soon as when March hit, everything went online.
Right.
The connection that they had in their classrooms, it basically disappeared. So they weren't forced to try to pick up English due to their environment.
So it's largely an
Yeah.
environmental concern, and then that barrier that they already face with their students is kind of compounded by being virtual, and already you had like some limited opportunities for interaction, and in a virtual space, that's even more limited because you have this huge screen barrier, right?
Yep, exactly. And then, like, even if we go on and elaborate too, those students who are EL through online, if you're in a Zoom, let's say I'm sure many of the people in the audience, really everyone has been in a Zoom, you feel anxious to probably unmute or speak up about a situation. So imagine if you really didn't know, like, the language that was being spoken like all too well. Would you feel comfortable speaking up? I'm sure I know I personally wouldn't. So,
Right.
mhm,
And I have a follow-up question for you about that, I guess. And I know that a lot of the people who have joined us today might not necessarily identify as an EL student, but do you have any suggestions on what they can do to support students, even if they don't identify as an EL student, something they can do to just make it a bit more inclusive and comfortable?
mhm. Yeah. So if anyone else is listening, EL students, like even though they might have different concerns than you, they're still students. They go to school with you. You guys probably have so much in common that you probably just don't realize. Just go out and just go text a EL student or just go talk to them like any normal person. Because frankly, I'm sure that you would like to be talked to like a normal person. So just go out, reach, text, just make sure to communicate and make sure, because even though we've been online, even though we've been thrown into this massive world of digital technology, we can use that to our advantage by since the door for communication has been opened.
Right. I absolutely love that message, Kevin, because I feel like many times we get caught up in our own struggles and we don't often think to sympathize with what others might be going through. So the fact that you've had the opportunity to reach out and learn about EL students and the specific challenges that they're facing and the words of encouragement that you just gave our audience about how they too can take those little actions to reach out and make it more inclusive. I think that that's a huge takeaway to walk away with after this live. Um, some other groups you were touching on before, a little vaguely, were athletes and these high performing, maybe college oriented students. So, what kind of impacts have you seen on that side of the spectrum?
Yeah, so first let me start talking about athletes. So I'm sure everyone knows an athlete, or many of a lot of people participate in athletics. So athletes, they've been thrown completely off a cliff whenever March started. Practices were canceled, competitions were completely eliminated, and some seasons were entirely removed. And a lot of those students, they depended on athletics as a motivation to do well in school. And also by doing athletics, it helped serve as a socio-emotional connection to them through connecting through teammates, through connecting through coaches.
Right. So, without that connection, what are some of the maybe negative sentiments that you've heard for athletes who are out of the season? But on the flip side, what are some positives that you've heard of opportunities that this virtual environment has presented that otherwise would not have been open to them as athletes?
So if you're just going to touch a little bit on the negatives, I know that I personally play a sport, and being away from my teammates for so long, it really has impacted me, because you miss the little things like the after practice, like talking to each other in the locker rooms, or just communicating on the fields, being able to support each other. That the social emotional connection is something that I've heard of as a smob, hearing from different students, but this was something that I also felt myself. And even without negatives, there's still some positives that probably aren't really focused upon. So many students have had the option to do remote scouting, or having people come in. Yeah. Sorry, that you say something, Jay Sherry?
No. I just said you were
Okay.
good.
Okay. So many people have had the option to do remote scouting. So I know many students who've had people all the way from California looking at their highlights, looking at their clips, and being able to scout them when ordinarily they would have had to have flown all the way in and just come to your high school practice to look at you. So it really opens up the world to seeing a lot of athletes perform. And also, a lot of athletes have had the the opportunity to focus on their self development. So not really comparing yourself to another person, but really trying to improve on who you are, how you can really get into the space of the sport. What can you do to improve versus looking at someone else? And I do feel like that message is going to be very beneficial for a lot of students.
Right. I have to agree with Emily in our comments here, where she says that's an incredible message. And honestly, I didn't think of it that way. But I guess with a lot of competitive sports, at some point you might be at a level where you're becoming enclosed in this like toxic competition where you value your success at your sport based on whether you're outperforming other people or whether you're getting wins. But when you remove yourself from that competition, while that can be disappointing in some ways, I like that message that you tied in of how it gives room for a lot of self improvement and just practicing your own skills for the sake of bettering your own craft and becoming a better sports player at what you're passionate about. So that's a very interesting takeaway that I think a lot of people might not have looked at it that way, but can walk away from this live looking at it that way. Um, as we're kind of wrapping up here, do you have any final words to members of these special groups that you've been addressing, our EL students, our athletes? Just final words of encouragement, takeaways.
The final words I just want to say is that athletes, EL students, even like our high achieving students, we're at the end of the day all students. We all share certain concerns which are universal, such as that need, that belongingness for the social emotional connection. And so the word I can leave on is connect. Make sure to connect and reach out. Reach out to those people who you haven't talked to in a while. Check up on their mental health. Be sure to do that. And especially for athletes, be sure to ask them how they're doing. EL students, make sure to just communicate, talk about everyday things, because that's what they need. That's what our athletes, that's what our EL students need. That's even what our high achieving students need, who might feel alone. So really use that technology, use the world we've been thrown into. I always try to get something good from it and just try to connect. That's it.
Right. And the way that you summarized everything that you said in these past 15 minutes or so, so eloquently into one word, and that is connect, right? It all comes back to connecting. And I love how you tied in connecting with EL students who might feel alone, or high performing students who might feel like they can't reach their goals because of test cancellations, or athletes who were looking forward to being recruited and now feel like they can't pursue that end. It all goes back to connecting. So thank you for leaving us with that one final message that's going to really stick in everyone's heads. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us, Kevin.
Yep. Thank you for having me on, Jayshree. Really appreciate talking to everyone.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.
And don't worry, guys, we still have more students joining us from the Maryland Center for School Safety Student Focus Group. But I think we should all give Kevin a very nice round of applause in the chat, because he had some great takeaways there that we can all learn from. Just that simple word of connect. I think that's something that we can carry with us and apply in all respects of our life. So with Kevin, we heard about different groups of students and how they're adjusting to virtual learning in different ways. But now we're going to be joined by Henry Miser, who's another student on the student focus group. And he's going to be talking about an adjustment that all of us have made, and that is the adjustment to virtual learning, right? Regardless of what kind of student you are, we've all had to adjust to virtual. Hi, Henry.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I am good. So my name is Henry Miser, and I am from Calvert County, Maryland, and I attend St. Mary's Riken.
And I know that today you and I said we were just going to be thinking out loud about the difficulties that we've all experienced in transitioning to virtual school. So if we had to kind of break that difficulty up into a smaller chunk, what students would you say have been hit the hardest by this virtual school transition?
So this year I went from 9th grade to 10th grade, but I can
Mhm.
only imagine that transition was hard enough for me, but it would be even harder for someone who was going from, let's say, middle school to high school or high school to college. It was hard enough for me not being able to go meet my teachers, go to back to school night, and just kind of get an overall understanding of my classes at the beginning of the year. But having to change from school to school in the middle of a global pandemic while also not knowing that many people, I can only imagine that was a really hard transition to make.
Right. And I honestly can agree with your sentiments there, because if even though both of us aren't necessarily freshmen or, freshmen in college who've experienced that transition, just to put yourself in their shoes for a second, you're essentially part of a new school community, but you haven't met any of those teachers in person. You've never walked, well, you've probably not experienced that in-school experience very much, and you may not have had the opportunity to meet very many of your peers. So you're thrown into this new community that you essentially don't know very much about, which can be overwhelming, like you said. But one interesting thing, I guess, to see how different students like make the best of it at different schools is at my school. Even though the freshmen have never stepped foot into our high school, they were the ones who won our Spirit Week, and they actually beat out us, like as seniors.
That's crazy.
I know. So it just shows that, like, if you really put your mind to it, then even those cusp grades can try to make their transition a little bit easier by getting involved. But
Definitely.
right. But shifting gears a little bit, what are some of those immediate negatives that you felt like you experienced when that sudden lockdown hit and you were suddenly in virtual school?
So one thing that I noticed pretty much immediately after a week or two of virtual learning is the missing of the conversations with your friends on the walk to classes, with your teachers when you go eat lunch with them, and just the general engagement that you get in the school day. We still do get some engagement with our teachers during virtual classes, but it's not the same as having like face-to-face engagement, having those conversations that are always related to what you're learning in class that day. Another thing that I've noticed more so in this school year than last, and I'm sure everyone else has, are the missing of normal activities such as prom or homecoming or Spirit Week. I know I have missed Spirit Week a lot at our school. Everyone really gets into it, and especially like I was kind of saying earlier, the freshmen, they kind of get into this new routine for them, and they didn't really get to experience that this year. So that was definitely something that I would say schools across the country has missed. Um, but I will say that a lot of these schools have managed to, take homecoming or prom and make it some kind of virtual event. So I would definitely applaud those schools who have been able to do that and take virtual learning into something that can still be enjoyed to some extent by their students.
Right. And you bring up a pretty good point there because I feel like as students, many times when we look at those new normals, like that virtual prom or, just the facets of virtual schooling, our first reaction at times can be like, this isn't the normal that we're used to. So you automatically want to reject that. But we have to recognize, like you said, that the schools are making an effort to give us that same in school experience, even though we're not in school. So at least to respect and recognize the efforts that they're making, the least that we can do is to appreciate it by getting engaged and getting involved and
Of
getting
course.
excited like we did if we were.
Yes.
So on that, we're kind of going to that more positive sphere, right? So as we're talking about positives, what are some of the biggest positives that you've experienced with this new virtual schooling environment?
So I know something that I've enjoyed, I know maybe some others, is the break that we get in between classes. I know at my school it's kind of enforced that, you walk to class and you get there pretty much on as early as you can, sit down and get ready for class. With this new virtual learning environment, it's allowed us to take as long of a break as we need, go get some water, get a snack, interact with family, or FaceTime your friends. And also kind of going off of this way of, breaks and using your own time, it allows us to kind of fit your time out to how you want it to be. So if you know that you need to get something done before something else, it kind of takes away the school's kind of interjection of you need to do this now, which I have found really helpful when it comes down to studying for a test or getting ready for a different class. And another thing that I know that has kind of been a hot and cold subject recently are breakout rooms. We just kind of started using them at my school. And I know sometimes it's really great because I get put with people that I haven't talked to in almost a year,
Yeah.
but also it can be really awkward sometimes because, you get in there, no one really wants to talk. So you just kind of sit there in silence waiting for the other person to say something.
Right. But breakout rooms are a great example of kind of that like new normal that you can adapt to if you try. And while your experience with them isn't always going to be 100%, you're going to have some good experiences that are optimizing what you would have gotten in school, even though you may not be in school. And something interesting about what you were saying about having a lot more autonomy and control over your schedule with this new virtual model is that if you think about it, like that's where we're all heading in the future as we head toward college or career, like those future steps. You get more of these restrictions taken down and a lot more freedom to decide what you want to do with your time. So it's really cool that we get to experience and trial that, even though we're not necessarily in that phase of our life yet.
Definitely.
So, with that note, what final words would you leave everyone with in terms of virtual learning and bigger takeaways that we can walk away with?
Of course. So, I mean, at the end of the day, I'd say everyone can probably admit that this has been absolutely terrible. But, I find that the silver lining in things, and you kind of have to look forward, it's required us to be so adaptive and change so quickly. And overall, in my opinion, we're better off because of it. We've had to learn to use these new digital tools, both us and our teachers, at the snap of a finger, whether it be Google Classboard or Jamboard or whatever programs your school has been using. We've been had to find the best way to meet, whether it be Zoom or Google Meet, and deal with the Wi-Fi issues, the connectivity issues, or having to miss class because you can't get stable Wi-Fi. And while all of these have been absolutely terrible, overall, as a country, as a student leader community, we will emerge as stronger individuals, stronger leaders, and stronger students because of it. And that will help us in the future. And I know right now it may seem like there is no light at the end of the tunnel, but I assure you that there is, and I encourage you to look for it, because if you do not, it will make your life a lot harder.
Right. And I think Emily in the comments kind of summarized that outlook that you're talking about perfectly in 2 words, and that is just being a resilience warrior, Like you said, recognizing that we're getting this, I don't want to say special because at times it doesn't feel special, but it's a unique, distinct kind of experience that previous generations did not get to experience, and we're going through it. And as we're running and learning, we're adapting to all these new skills, like you said, and that light at the end of the tunnel seems like it's getting closer. So like you said, if we all stay hopeful, I think that we can make it through the final stretch of this. Thank you so much for joining us, Henry.
No problem. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye. Okay, and still stay back because we have more students joining us from the student focus group. Crazy enough, we just talked about this concept of virtual schooling, and a few months ago, that would have been, not a few months ago, about a year ago, I would say now. About a year ago, that would have been a very novel concept, right? The idea of virtual schooling. And yeah, in the comments, show some love to Henry because he did a really good job of articulating his points. So let's get a round of applause before we do move on to our next topic. Okay, I'm seeing that outpouring of love coming in. Right. So, like I was saying, crazy enough, while the idea of virtual schooling was really novel about a year ago, now that we were all slowly adjusting to it, we're getting to that point where a lot of our counties are looking to reopen schools in some kind of new format as a hybrid model. And the idea of just getting used to virtual schooling and then suddenly being asked to retransition into a new normal of hybrid can be a little bit overwhelming. And to talk about that, we're going to be joined by Grace Heron from our student focus group. And the request has been sent, and we're waiting for Grace to join us. Hi, Grace.
Hi, is it working?
Yes, it is.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm Grace Heron. I'm a junior at North Harvard High School, and I'm from Harford County.
Yep. And I hear you were telling me the other day that for Harford County, you guys are looking at going back for March 1st. So how has that been? What kind of feelings are you experiencing right now?
So elementary schoolers go back 2 days a week, I think on March 1st, and then middle and high schoolers go back 1 day a week, starting March 15th. And honestly, it's super exciting. I'm a person that loves interaction with people, and this quarantine has given me perspective of how much I really love school. And I seem like a nerd saying that, but I like the social aspect, and I'm a much more of a school person than a virtual person. So at least for me, I'm really excited to go back, but it's also a little scary because we've been going through all this virtual learning for a year, and it means all of our tests. I mean, I feel like we all have taken advantage of the online learning with tests, looking up answers, using calculators and all that stuff. Sleeping during class, playing video games, just kind of slacking off because it's virtual. I feel like everyone can agree with that. But the transition I'm worried for is being too tired in the morning and not being prepared for school. And it's hard to take advantage or to change the way you do stuff when you've been doing it for so long. And I'm like, yeah, I'm so excited for school. And then I'm like, oh no, my classes, like that stuff. So yeah, that's just some stuff I'm worried about for in-person school.
Right. So obviously you have like a whole mix of emotions going on there. Like one thing I will say I'm very glad to see you like being happy about is just that idea of going back to school, because I know in a lot of other counties, and even in my county, if I take it as an example, I'm not really seeing people being excited about the prospect of going back to school, and there's more fixation on the negatives. So it's nice to see you like taking it for its positives and trying to make the best of it. But at the same time, you do mention that there's like a good amount of new stuff to get used to that we've kind of like unlearned over the past year of like slacking off in virtual school. So what kinds of habits are you cultivating, and like what are you doing to prepare for that big transition?
So I'm trying to get more sleep, and it's hard when your sleep schedule's been off for so long. But
Yeah.
if you're going back into school, you're waking up like 2 hours more than you usually wake up, and that's a lot of sleep difference, at least for me, because I like sleep. So it's hard to wake up earlier, but you got to get your sleep schedule back on track, which is hard, at least for me. Not procrastinating, not putting stuff off, because now you're in school. It's like you have to do stuff in that class. You can't wait till, lunch, or you can't wait till that. Keeping your notes, taking notes now. And absolutely taking care of your physical health too. Getting exercise, drinking water, because you can't just go from one room to the other. You're moving around, you're waking up. It puts a strain on your body, so you have to get ready for that as well. So those are all baby steps that I'm taking, because you can't just push yourself 100% into a change like that. It's going to be a lot of physical and mental strain. But if you take baby steps and you get yourself slowly ready to go back, then when we do go back, at least one day a week, all day a week, every day a week is another story. At least this is just for one day a week. You'll be in a better position mentally and physically for school. And even though it's hard to get out of the quarantine slums, it's absolutely impossible. You have to do it, and it's hard, but. Mm-hmm.
I love how you're like bringing up the idea of like starting now with your baby steps, because I feel like for a lot of us, quarantine has kind of made your procrastination abilities get even better. So this is one area we can really procrastinate and be like, I'm only going to start cultivating healthy habits and doing everything I need to do for school once I'm forced to go back into the building. So the fact that you're talking about taking these little steps now and focusing on some of those things that we don't usually think about, like even physical health. I know for myself, I've gotten so used to just like sitting in this chair. So now when you like go out to like Target for a few hours, just little things like that, you notice yourself getting much more tired than you would have gotten like a year ago, where you're going all around everywhere and like exploring.
For sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But as we kind of like close out, I'm sure you've like somewhat envisioned that moment where you like walk back into school, and I'm sure that a lot of other people who are in that stage of maybe going back are thinking about that moment as well. So do you have any advice for how to deal with that specific moment when you walk into that building after so long?
Oh gosh, at least for me, like even though I'm like excited for all of this, it's gonna be overwhelming, because it's like school's a high stress environment, and walking back into that like so suddenly, you're like, oh god. So gotta walk into it with an open mind. Even if you're excited to go back, even if you're not excited to go back, like it's gonna be a change, no matter the change you want, the change you need, the change you don't want, anything. You're gonna have to have an open mind so you can adapt to whatever approaches you. So just walking in there try to have a positive mindset and try to open up your mind to it all, then you'll be the most successful. That's what I'm trying to stay positive about it all and take the steps I need to, so I can survive one day a week. So
I'm sure you're going to do great, because you're talking about how you're already taking all these little steps now. And that means you're like kind of one step ahead of the punch. You're not going to go back into school and be totally overwhelmed, because you're starting that transition. And one good thing that you said was just the importance of having an open mind, like sometimes, like you said, that it's not going to be the most optimal situation, because school is a high stress environment inherently. So the idea of just like being blanketly positive isn't always going to work out, but at least if you can like keep your mind open to whatever challenges come your way and just trying to deal with them with some of those healthy habits that you mentioned, I think that you and everyone else out there who's probably going back for hybrid will be very successful. So thank you for joining us and sharing all of your tips.
Yes, thank you for having me. Bye.
Bye, Grace. And finally, we have one last student joining us from the Maryland Center for School Safety Student Focus Group. And throughout this entire live so far, we've discussed quite a few situations that have induced all of us some stress, whether that's experiencing disruptions as an athlete. Oh yeah, I keep forgetting this part. Show love to Grace, because Grace just came on here and she gave us all this beautiful advice about transitioning back to school, and she's making that brave step to actually go back. And I know that for a lot of us, myself included, we're a little bit apprehensive and we're not as brave and bold as Grace to just go back and take it with that positive attitude. So just for that, give her some extra love, extra applause, extra hearts in the comments. Yep. So now, transitioning on to the final part of our live, we've talked about a lot of situations today that induce stress, whether that's experiencing it from the lens of an EL student, an athlete, a high-performing student, or making the transition to virtual school, and now transitioning back to in-person school. It's a highly volatile world that we're living in where things are changing very quickly. But the commonality between all these different stress-inducing situations that we discussed is that they involve change. And as humans, we have a little bit of a tendency to have this negative, scared attitude towards change, which is where a lot of our stress can come from. So now I'm going to bring in Claire from our student focus group to talk to us a little bit more about how we can change our mindset, maybe by using this thing called the resilience cycle. So let's try to bring Claire on here now. Resilience warriors. I like that. I feel like all of you who joined us today, like we are together, we are resilience warriors. Hi, Claire.
Hi, everybody. I'm super excited to be here.
Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, guys. My name's Claire. I am from Baltimore County and Hereford High School, and I am in 9th grade.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to be talking a little bit about the resilience cycle today. And you and I have kind of talked about this before. We've presented about this concept before, but for anyone who's just sitting there totally confused about what the resilience cycle is, do you want to give them a bit of an overview of what we're going to be talking about?
Sure. So the resilience cycle is a simple step-by-step process describing how humans interpret change in their lives. And this cycle applies to every change you experience in every situation. And you'll see this as we walk through it. But it's basically a broad overview of how your brain interprets change, and we'll walk you through it step by step with a specific situation.
Right. And just to give you a little trailer of the steps that are coming up ahead, you have your different phases as a resilience cycle. And those are change, loss, distrust, discomfort, choice, engagement, and reunification. So you have those 7 steps. Right now, they just sound like words, but by the time Claire and I are done explaining it, and hopefully with a situation that's near and dear to all of us, it'll make a little bit more sense and you'll be able to implement it in your own lives. So let's start by talking about change, right? So one huge change that we've been talking about throughout this live is adjusting to the world of COVID and all the different changes that that poses, whether that's wearing a mask when you go out or whether that's transitioning to virtual school. So the first stage of the resilience cycle is simply your brain looking at the change before you. So in this case, a worldwide pandemic, just a little tiny change, and you start processing it. So Claire, how does your brain process that?
Sure. So we go straight from change into loss. So your brain automatically goes to the bad and what you're losing from the change. Your brain asks yourself the question, What losses do I have from this change? So in the case of COVID-19 and the pandemic, you may turn to all the negatives that you've experienced from it. I have to wear a mask in public and it's uncomfortable. I have to transition to virtual school and I'm not used to it. I'm not able to see my friends safely and it's hard to connect with them through online platforms. So it's just kind of your brain immediately going to the bad and not considering anything else.
Right. And I thought that was interesting when we first learned about this together, because a lot of us talk about this idea of like positive psychology and positivity and being happy. So it's very interesting to see that when faced with a change, the first instinctive reaction for our brains is to go to those losses. And I think that's very telling of why sometimes we react to situations the way we do. But moving to the next step, the more that you kind of ruminate in that loss phase, you develop this distrust. So you've become more and more fixated on all the different losses that you have from COVID in this case. Like you can't see your friends, you have to wear a mask, all these negative things, and you're not liking it. So you build this protective wall around yourself, and within that wall, it's just you, and it's all of these negative perceptions that you've built around this change. And as a result of just kind of ruminating in that negativity, you begin to distance yourself from others and you just spend a lot of time by yourself focused on the negatives. And in the case of COVID, I'm sure that all of us have gone through this phase at least once, in the initial stages, maybe even still now, depending on what part of your journey you're on, where some days you just feel overwhelmed with all the negatives and you're sitting there and you don't want to talk to anyone and you're just in this very negative headspace. But what happens next, Claire?
So from this distrust, you go to discomfort. So you're really uncomfortable with a lot of the changes that have occurred at this point. So in terms of our situation with COVID-19, you may be uncomfortable reaching out to a teacher during online school because you feel like, I'm not used to this. I don't think I should be doing this. Maybe you're uncomfortable reaching out to a friend through FaceTime. Maybe you and your friend don't FaceTime all the time, but that's the only way you can connect. Maybe you're uncomfortable with wearing a mask out in public because you're not used to it. So you're in the change now. You've gotten through a couple steps, but you're still really uncomfortable with it and still processing it.
Right, and now is when we have our first turning point. If you'll notice, up until now, our instinctive reaction was to go into this negative spiral almost. And okay, like everyone spends their time in their negative spiral, but now you have a choice. That is our next stage. You have a choice of whether you want to continue down this negative spiral, keep going and ruminating with the negatives, isolating yourself, and defining yourself by the change that has occurred in your life and the negative consequences that seem to accompany it. Or you can kind of diverge from that path and start trying to perceive things in a positive way. So in this choice stage, I guess that it's a turning point that many of us have reached, where with virtual school or wearing a mask, you have this breaking point where almost like, am I going to keep complaining about this, or am I going to try to make the best of this situation? So what happens, Claire, if you do try to kind of diverge from the negative path and try to make the best of the situation?
Right. So now that you've made the choice to go down a more positive path, you are now on the engagement step. So look at the positives. Find ways to combat this change in your life and the things you can do with it. So maybe we are in virtual school and we don't like this setting. However, we've gained 2 more hours of sleep and we have more time in between classes to take breaks. Right. Well, maybe we don't really enjoy going to the store in a mask, but maybe on cold days it's comfortable and it's warm. I know for me, that's been something that I loved about masks. Maybe with your friends, it's been difficult to reach out through FaceTime, but maybe you find that we can do other things. We can go through Instagram. We can chat through there. I know if you do the live video through Instagram, you can share pictures with each other. So you've gotten exposed to a ton of different things with COVID-19 in terms of technology. So kind of just straying away from the negatives, starting to look at the positives. It's going to help you change your mindset, and it's going to help you and your mental health improve significantly when looking upon a change that you at first perceived negatively.
Right. And when you go into that more positive way of thinking, the tangible consequence and result of making that choice, which can honestly sometimes be very difficult, to not continue down the negative path and to consciously switch over to the more positive way of thinking, is that you experience this last stage of the resilience cycle called reunification, where you find yourself comfortable with the change and you can separate yourself from the situation, right? That's something that we often have trouble doing as humans. You just get very tangled, your emotions get tangled, and you find it difficult to look at things that happen in your life from an objective perspective. But in the case of COVID, if you're in this reunification stage, you can now kind of sit back and recognize both the losses and the gains that you've taken out of this experience. And that's all too key, because you're still recognizing that there are losses. It's not this totally vanilla, unattainable mindset. But at the same time, you're sure to recognize the gains. So, like Claire was saying a little bit before, if you take our example, maybe some of your gains are that few extra hours of sleep. And maybe you're someone who's more reserved. So participating on Jamboard and Pear Deck is working out great for you, as opposed to raising your hand in person. And maybe wearing a mask is comfortable on those cold days, right? And you can still look at the negatives and say, well, I'm a senior and I'm missing out on my last senior year experiences, or I'm a freshman and I haven't gotten to meet people so much in my school so far. But that's okay, because now you have a weighing scale. You're not too leaning in one direction or the other. So you have this more balanced mindset to work off of. So,
Right.
Claire,
And one important thing I
Uh-huh.
wanted to add
Right.
was that this cycle can be applied to every single change in your life. We use COVID to apply because we know everybody had experienced that, but it's constantly starting and ending, and it's just continuous in all aspects of your life. And I hope from this live and all the information we provided, you can kind of see that process, that thought process as you're going through things. When I first learned about this cycle, I had a change in my life, and I was like, oh my goodness, my brain is going through all of these steps. So just recognizing what we've shared with you today and kind of using that to help build a better mindset and a better confrontation to change, it's really going to help out, I promise.
Right. And Claire, if you don't mind, I'm thinking that based on the different stages that we shared today, where do you guys feel like you're at in relation to, taking this COVID as an example? Do you feel like you're still kind of on that negative path? Do you feel like you're at the cusp of making a choice? Or do you feel like you're in that engagement or reunification phase? If you guys do feel comfortable kind of sharing where you're at in your journey. And if not, we totally respect your privacy and understand.
Yeah, for sure. Go ahead and put it in the chat. I'm really curious because I know for me, it's consistent. It's been a consistent cycle. I know right now for me, the change is going back to in-person school. I know it was just announced for Baltimore County. So I kind of automatically went to the losses and was like, man, I'm losing 2 hours of sleep. I'm losing all that time in between classes. But then at the same time, I started to go into that choice path. Okay, I have negatives, but I can choose to look at more positives and be excited about it.
Right. And I think that's a perfect example. You're vulnerable enough to kind of share what's going on in your personal life. Even though you've already experienced the resilience cycle like once before, you're showing how when you're presented with a new change, you kind of go back to like stage one again. So it's a continuous learning and evolution process. So Alana
For sure.
said she's on the reunification stage, which is amazing. We love to hear that you're kind of at that stage in the midst of this pandemic where maybe it took you a year to get here, but you are able to recognize losses and gains in tandem. So that's pretty amazing, Alana. And thank you for sharing.
Right. And it's important to note that we're not saying with this cycle you always forget the negatives and kind of just push those to the side, because recognize those and how they impact you. Just making sure, and that's the big thing with the reunification step, seeing your gains, but also recognizing your losses and kind of balancing those out so you can have a good mindset.
Right. And we have one final comment from Emily saying that not being able to come home, and her home is in the Midwest, has been so hard. I have chosen to try to find the positivity. I'm in contact with my family more. So that kind of shows where she was at that cusp at one point of making a choice between diverging down a negative path, of just recognizing all the negatives and not being able to be with your family. But she consciously changed her pattern to be more in the engagement and reunification phase, where now she's feeling comfortable with the given situation. So that's amazing. Thank you to Emily and Alana, both of you, for sharing what's going on in your personal lives, and Claire too, obviously. That goes without saying. Claire, thank you so much for joining me today to talk about the resilience cycle.
Thank you for having me, Jayshree. Thank you, everyone.
Bye. And with that, obviously, let's get some applause for Claire in the comments section for all of the amazing insights that she shared with us. Applause, hearts, all of those good things. Yes, and Emily is honestly one of the best focus group leaders and hype coaches for helping us think in that more positive way. And I love to see the outpouring of love for Claire. And on that positive note, let's begin to kind of wrap things up here today. It's been an amazing hour getting to share all of our thoughts with you all and engage in a conversation as a group of students, as a community. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments section, and an MCSS representative will address them at a later point in case I wasn't able to get to anything today that you wanted to hear about. If you liked hearing about the student focus group today, you heard from a lot of members of the Maryland Center for School Safety Student Focus Group. And if you liked that dynamic and that's something that you would be interested in being a part of, here's a little plug for you. Applications for the 2021-2022 Student Focus Group are open through March 31st, and they are on a rolling basis. Emily asks, how can you apply to be a part of this group? And you can go to this URL. I'm going to lift my phone for a moment, so I apologize if you get an up-close view of my face. It is schoolsafety.maryland.gov. And you'll notice that on that website, there is a button for you to click that will allow you to apply for the student focus group. And all it takes is a quick written application, and after that you'll know if you're invited for interview or not. And those applications are rolling, so the sooner you show interest, the greater chance you have of becoming a part of the group. And we really do value your genuine interest in us, and we will reciprocate that. So yes, Henry, thank you so much. If you could put a direct link to the application, I can try to pin that in the comments, because I know that what I put in did not flag as an actual link. But overall, today we talked about a lot. We talked about a lot of different stressful changes. But for all of you out there, keep your head up and remember the resilience cycle as a way to approach big changes, whether that's related to what we talked about in terms of adjusting to virtual learning, transitioning back to school, being an athlete, being an EL student, being a high achieving student, or really any other change that crops up in your life. Dealing with change in a positive way transcends far beyond what we're dealing with right now. We're getting some really good and how you deal with them is going to define your experience with them. Thank you, Henry. And for those of you guys who are interested in the student focus group, that link is pinned. It's a comment that Henry put in. So it's henry.miser, and you'll see that app.smartsheet link that links directly to the student focus group applications. Thank you all for the love, and thank you so much for joining me and the other members of the student focus group today. And with that, I'm signing off. Bye, everyone.